Roger, in our last interview, you gave evidence from Shakespeare's longer poems that there was a consistent, coherent philosophy, and this was before the sonnets were published in 1609, and now we're going to look at the 1623 Folio.
Yes, we have been quite faithful to the original text, of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, etc., but particularly to the original text of the 1609 sonnets, because I claim that the only way to really tease out the philosophy that Shakespeare intentionally embeds in them is to respect the original edition. Any changed editions, emendations, or for any other reason, corrupts the philosophy and it makes it more difficult to see. So when we move to the 1623 Folio, which we have a copy of here, because I have written a commentary around the complete set of plays, the 36 plays in the 1623 Folio, an 800,000 word commentary. We also go back to the original 1623 edition, and for exactly the same reason, that is the text that his editors claimed was Shakespeare's text, and that any diversions, any abuse of that text in any form or other took away from the possibility of understanding his philosophy. They even suggested that if you didn't really like the way in which the plays were organised or the tenure of the plays in the 1623 edition, then you should go to other authors. You should put on Marlowe or Johnson, for instance, and just forget about Shakespeare rather than changing out Shakespeare. So if people are unsure about what it means to access or use the 1623 edition, because it's an Elizabethan typography, it's an Elizabethan spelling, then it only takes about a week or so to become familiar with all the aspects of the Elizabethan. So within a week or so, you can be reading it as if you're reading ordinary English. It's not like learning another language, which takes years to understand and to become fluent in, especially if you're going to be writing in it. So understanding the original Elizabethan text is not a problem particularly, but the thing that hangs people up really is the idea that there's a philosophy in there, or that they sense there's something in the plays when they put it on stage that causes them consternation. And that is probably the philosophy having an effect on them because they don't understand the philosophy. Back in the year 2000, when I created the Quaternary Institute, one of the aspects of the Quaternary Institute website that I made was called Quaternary Program. And in that Quaternary Program, I laid out a 3-year regime in which you would consider Shakespeare and consider the other authors who I've talked about previously, who make it possible to understand the philosophy. And so it's not necessarily an easy task to understand the philosophy, not because it's difficult, but because it's simple. In fact, Shakespeare said that what happens is that you have simple truth, which is miscalled simplicity. And the idea being, of course, that simple truth, which is the process of saying, is idealised, etc., and that causes the problems. And people have those prejudices loaded in their minds and find it difficult to understand where Shakespeare's coming from. To aid in the process of possibly seeing what happens when the Shakespeare's plays are put on stage, I generated a chart quite a number of years ago which shows the plays on stage, how they pass through the audience into their minds, and how Shakespeare accesses the natural logic at the back of their heads, cuts past their prejudices. But of course, when they go to put the plays on, they don't understand the philosophy, so their prejudices resurface and they call Shakespeare a businessman, or they say that he didn't have a philosophy and we can do anything we want to with his plays. But of course, that disrespects Shakespeare. And if you did that to anybody else, they'd really give you a hard time. So understanding the original is difficult, possibly, but it's incredibly rewarding, because the only way you can possibly write 800,000 words around the original folio, around every play in the folio, not just particular plays, is by applying the sonnet philosophy, and then it all just falls apart and you have an understanding that's just beyond what's available anywhere in primary, secondary or tertiary, which is why I established the Quaternary.
Roger, the 1623 Folio seems to have 3 divisions. It's different genres.
Yes, when we look at the folio, it's divided into 14 comedies, 10 histories and 12 tragedies. And you'd have to think if Shakespeare had a part in the arrangement of the 1623 Folio, because his colleagues knew him, they knew him well, His wife, Anne Hathaway, died in 1623 at the same time that the Folio was published. So there's a good chance that his intentions were being respected. And there's certainly a desire on the part of the editors to respect Shakespeare's intentions in terms of his text and what his plays might be saying. So what we find is that the 14 comedies are his way of demonstrating the utility of his philosophy, his nature-based philosophy. And so what you have is you have 11 female characters applying the philosophy throughout 11 of the plays, and you have 3 gender-balanced males applying the philosophy throughout the other 3 plays, all towards a successful resolution at the end of the plays. But when you move to the 10 histories and also the 12 tragedies, you have 22 plays in which no one character in any of those plays has an appreciation of Shakespeare's nature-based philosophy, or our nature-based philosophy, of course. And so what you end up with murder and mayhem, and that happens, of course, throughout the 10 histories, and happens particularly throughout the tragedies. And the hilarious thing, the ironical thing, I suppose, is that in the 1950s or whenever, the great tragedies were rated as Shakespeare's best plays, and yet, in fact, they're his way of demonstrating the consequences of misapplying our natural birthright understanding for misogynistic or male-based advantage. And so it's not surprising that when people look at the plays, they come up with categories like problem play. There's a number of problem plays, and different people have a different take on which plays are the problem plays. But really the problem lies with them, not with Shakespeare. There's no problem at all about Shakespeare's works. There's absolutely no problem. And so when people approach Shakespeare's works with preconceptions, or they find it difficult to understand aspects of his works, then they tend to denigrate Shakespeare, they tend to denigrate the compositors, they tend to denigrate the editors, but they don't accept their responsibility for not understanding. And because this material has now been out there in the world for over 20 years, then there's really no excuse for anyone to continue to misrepresent Shakespeare, to mispresent Shakespeare on stage and not to respect his original works.
Roger, when we look at the order of the plays in the 1623 Folio, what evidence do you think that there is that Shakespeare had input into that?
If the plays are not ordered chronologically, from 1590 to 1613, for instance, if we look at the history of the writing of the plays, we find that the comedies and the histories and the tragedies are dispersed. That he was writing a comedy at one point, then a history, then a tragedy. And my take on that is as if somehow or other the pleasure of writing the comedies was balanced or countermanded by the difficulty of having to write plays about the terrible misogyny, murders and mayhems consequent upon the English kings and the literature and the histories that lead him to the great characters, or the characters in the tragedies. If we look a bit more closely at the arrangement of the Folio and consider first the first play and the last play from each of the genres, the comedies, the histories and the tragedies, we find that The Tempest, which is about Prospero, who has a child, a daughter, who he rejects in a misogynistic rant, but then reevaluates his rejection and spends years studying. And the consequence of that is that he then effectively creates this mind space, this mythical mind space, in which he takes these characters, disembodied you might say, and corrects their prejudices and then returns them to mainland Italy. And of course the funny thing about it is that this first play, this Tempest, in the Folio, which is pretty much understood as being a play of Shakespeare's own devising, mimics the arrangement of the two longer poems, the Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. Venus and Adonis set in a mythical landscape, and the Rape of Lucrece set on mainland Italy. And then if we move to The Winter's Tale, which is the last play in the comedies in the Folio, we see that Leontes and Polixenes are in a terrible disagreement over the love for Hermione, Leontes' wife. The consequence is that Mamilius, Leontes' son, dies, and Hermione disappears, thought to be dead. And Antigonus, the husband of Paulina, Hermione's good friend, takes the baby Perdita to the shores of Bohemia. They're based in Sicily, so she takes the baby to Bohemia. But he's killed by a bear on the shores of Bohemia. And so there's the tragedy. There's a tragic beginning to the Winter's Tale, but then Perdita and her boyfriend Florizel, when they get old enough, they go back to Sicily and they remedy the problems that were created by their fathers. And so this comedy starts off as a tragedy and ends up with a comedic resolution, a typical comedic resolution consistent with the other 13 comedies. And so when you move to the 10 histories, what we find is that King John is separated out from the next history by a number of years, 100 or more years. And then you have a Richard II, 6 Henry plays, and then a Richard III. So you have Henry's plays sandwiched between 2 Richard plays. And then you have another gap before you then deal with the misogyny and the uxoricide, excuse me, I just needed to use that word, that Henry VIII commits upon his wives. It's wife murder, as a wife murderer. And Shakespeare deals with that. And of course, he only deals with the birth of Elizabeth, who goes on eventually to become one of England's more successful female queens. Ironically, after Henry's reign of expecting a male heir and then murdering the wives who didn't produce him one. And if we look at the tragedies, what we find in Troilus and Cressida and Cymbeline, the first and the last tragedies, is that the title characters don't die. All the other characters in their plays die. And so Troilus and Cressida don't die, but Hector dies, and Hector defends the taking of Helen, even though he argues that she should be returned for male-based brotherhood. He argues that she should be kept, and so he's the one who's killed. And then in Cymbeline, King Cymbeline, it's his wife who runs manically throughout the play, trying to get her son Cloten to become king, and she dies at the end of the play as well. So in the last play, a bit like the ideas behind the A Lover's Complaint, it's a female who runs mad, or a bit like Lady Macbeth in Macbeth, for instance. And so Shakespeare shows that an over-masculinized female can be as disastrous or as dire as an over-masculinized male.
Well, Roger, thank you for that. Looking forward to hearing more about the plays in the next video.
Yes, I think we have a few more things to say, so I'm also looking forward to presenting a little bit more about what I've understood about Shakespeare's works.